Welcome to the Cheating Confession Reddit channel. Today, I'm going to share with you a real-life cheating story. It will give you a better understanding of the issue of infidelity today and help you be more cautious when it comes to a cheating wife. Let's dive into this story together.
Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. Golden streaks of sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor as Nigel pored over his checklist for what felt like the 100th time. The clock ticked down relentlessly, just 6 hours until his parents arrived, and 7 before Marshall made his entrance. Every detail was planned with military precision. The ham needed exactly 3 hours in the oven, the side dishes followed a rigid timeline, and the desserts were already cooling on the counter. He took a brief moment to peer out the window, watching snowflakes meander lazily against a bleak gray sky. Through the swirling snow, the neighbors' holiday lights flickered cheerfully, a picture-perfect display that served as an unspoken reminder of his own incomplete to-do list. His coffee sat forgotten and cold on the counter, abandoned amid the chaos of his morning preparations. "You're spiraling again," Samantha's voice broke the silence, carrying an undertone Nigel couldn't quite identify. Irritation? Amusement? She leaned against the doorway in her silk robe, scrolling through her ever-present phone. "The house is fine," she said casually. "It has to be more than fine," he muttered, not looking up from his list. "You know how they are." "Oh, I'm well aware of how they are," she replied, her tone dripping with mockery. Pouring herself a cup of coffee, she kept her distance. "Especially your mother." Nigel ignored the jab and moved to the living room, where boxes of decorations sat waiting. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the last box of ornaments, its edges worn from years of use. A faint mix of cinnamon and pine hung in the air as he hung the final ornament, a fragile glass sphere gifted by his mother when he and Samantha got married. The tree's soft lights cast a warm glow across the room, illuminating the scene he had painstakingly curated over weeks. Each ornament told its own story. The silver star from their first Christmas, when they could barely afford decorations. The hand-painted globe from a Vermont trip, a reminder of happier times before the silences grew longer and the warmth between them faded. "Everything has to be just right," he whispered, adjusting a candy cane that hung askew. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation, buying gifts, decorating every inch of the house, and planning an elaborate menu. Nigel had even taken time off work to ensure perfection. A chime from Samantha's phone snapped him back to the present. He heard her footsteps retreating to the kitchen, followed by the faint tapping of her fingers on the screen. Lately, she seemed glued to her phone, always hiding the screen from him, her expression carrying a secretive smile that didn't escape his notice. The deep, resonant chime of the grandfather clock signaled 6 o'clock. His parents would arrive soon, early, as they always did. His father had long insisted that punctuality was a mark of good breeding. Adjusting the dark green sweater his mother had gifted him, chosen, no doubt, to match his eyes, Nigel headed to the kitchen, where the timer beeped insistently. "Samantha?" he called, only to be met with silence. On the counter sat a half-empty glass of wine, her third for the day despite the early hour. With a sigh, he moved to check on the appetizers. The kitchen was a battlefield of mixing bowls and ingredients, but Samantha was nowhere in sight. Her phone lay face down by the sink, lighting up briefly with a notification before dimming. He glimpsed the name Marshall on the screen. A wave of memories washed over him. Last month's dinner, Samantha's laughter at Marshall's jokes, the lingering glances they shared, the brush of her hand against Marshall's arm. Each moment, insignificant on its own, came together to form a troubling picture. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Straightening his posture, Nigel pushed his doubts aside and opened the door. His mother swept in, her floral perfume enveloping him as she pulled him into a quick hug. "Merry Christmas, darling," she said brightly, her silver hair glinting under the entryway light, perfectly styled despite the weather. Behind her, his father followed, surveying the room with the critical eye of a judge about to deliver a verdict. "The tree's lopsided," his father remarked, stepping inside without removing his coat. "Marshall would have fixed that. Remember the display he put together for the country club? Won first place." Nigel forced a tight smile, swallowing the familiar sting of comparison. Marshall's achievements were the centerpiece of every family gathering. "And these garlands?" his father continued, gesturing toward the decorations. "Store-bought, aren't they? Your brother always uses real pine, makes them himself." "They're safer this way," Nigel replied evenly, helping his mother out of her luxurious coat, another gift no doubt from Marshall. "Playing it safe, that's always been your problem," his father said with a dismissive snort. "You'll never get ahead by being so cautious." "Where's Samantha?" his mother asked, smoothing her dress. "I brought the sugar cookie recipe she wanted. Marshall's already using it for his office party. Always so thoughtful, that boy." Nigel glanced toward the kitchen, realizing he hadn't seen Samantha in over an hour. "She's working on the appetizers," he lied. As if on cue, Samantha appeared, her blonde hair slightly disheveled but quickly smoothed down as she adjusted her festive apron. Her smile was bright and practiced. "Margaret, Robert, so glad you're here," she exclaimed, embracing them warmly. "I've been experimenting with that recipe you mentioned, Margaret. Can't wait for you to try it." Nigel watched as she charmed his parents effortlessly, leading them into the kitchen. Left alone in the entryway, he steeled himself for the inevitable arrival of Marshall, whose dramatic entrances always commanded attention. The evening crawled by, each moment punctuated by fresh reminders of Marshall's successes, the new sailboat, the six-figure fundraiser. Meanwhile, Samantha's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She disappeared into the pantry or upstairs, always returning flushed, her phone a constant companion. At exactly 7:30, the doorbell rang again. Nigel's heart sank as he approached the door, each step heavy with dread. When he opened it, there stood Marshall, his tailored suit dusted with snow, his grin as self-assured as ever. The image was painfully familiar. Marshall, effortlessly perfect, embodying everything Nigel had spent his life striving to achieve. A bottle of fine champagne dangled casually from one hand, while the other cradled a stack of meticulously wrapped gifts. Marshall's voice carried through the foyer with an authority that seemed to swallow up Nigel's presence. "Hey there, little brother," he called, pulling Nigel into a swift embrace that carried the faint scent of expensive cologne. "The place looks great, though that tree, it's a bit crooked, isn't it? Let me handle that." Before Nigel could respond, Marshall thrust the champagne into his hands and strode purposefully to the tree. Their parents watched, their faces alight with admiration, as Marshall adjusted the ornaments and repositioned the trunk. His movements were precise, almost theatrical, as though performing for an invisible audience. Each tweak felt like an unspoken critique of Nigel's efforts. "There," Marshall said, stepping back and dusting off his hands as if he'd accomplished a major feat. "Much better. You've always struggled with details like this, haven't you?" He chuckled warmly. "Remember those model airplanes you used to make? The wings never quite lined up." Their parents joined in with indulgent laughter, swept up in Marshall's charm. "Where's my favorite sister-in-law?" he asked, heading toward the kitchen without waiting for an answer. Nigel followed, the cold champagne still in his grip, feeling more like an observer than a participant. Samantha's brisk footsteps echoed as she approached Marshall, her movements quick and deliberate, almost eager. By the time Nigel entered the kitchen, Marshall had already poured himself a glass of wine and was comfortably settled in the space. Samantha stood close by, her cheeks flushed as she described the evening's menu. "I made those crab puffs you liked so much at the barbecue," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture Nigel remembered well from their early days together. "You remembered?" Marshall replied, his voice rich with appreciation. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Nigel's stomach tightened as he watched her hand linger against Marshall's while she handed him a plate. When they moved past each other, Marshall's hand brushed against the small of her back, a fleeting but intimate gesture. Individually, the moment seemed innocuous, but together they painted a picture that twisted the knot in Nigel's chest tighter. Dinner's ready, Samantha announced, breaking the tense silence. Nigel, could you help me bring these to the table? The dining room gleamed under the chandelier's glow. Fine china and crystal glasses were arranged with meticulous care. As everyone took their seats, Nigel noticed Samantha shifting to sit next to Marshall, disregarding the place cards she'd set earlier. The table looks wonderful, Margaret said, smoothing her napkin in her lap. Marshall, didn't you do something like this for that charity gala? The one with the ice sculptures? Oh, absolutely, Marshall said, his grin widening as he swirled his wine. I had them carved into angels. We raised over $50,000 that night. He turned to Samantha. You should have been there. It was unforgettable. I'm sure it was, Samantha murmured, her gaze lingering on him. Maybe next time. The meal dragged on, with Nigel's parents dominating the conversation, sharing tales of their Mediterranean cruise and their plans for the new year. Marshall punctuated the chatter with stories of his recent triumphs, including a lucrative business deal. The client insisted I handle it personally, he said, casually swirling his glass. When you're good at what you do, word spreads fast. That's our boy, Robert said, raising his glass in a toast. Always knew you had the makings of a leader, just like your old man. He turned to Nigel. You could learn a thing or two from your brother. Being assertive is a valuable skill. Nigel pushed his food around his plate, his appetite dampened by the tension swirling around the table. Beneath the tablecloth, he noticed Samantha's foot brushing against Marshall's. The subtle movement was obscured to everyone else but glaringly obvious to him. Her phone buzzed periodically, and she checked it discreetly, her lips curling into faint smiles. So, any baby news? Margaret asked suddenly, her eyes darting between Nigel and Samantha. The question landed like a thunderclap. Samantha's fork clinked against her plate, the sound unnervingly loud. Not yet, she replied tersely. Beneath the table, her hand clamped onto Nigel's thigh, her nails digging into his leg as if to silence him. These things take time, Margaret said sympathetically. Although Marshall and his ex-wife didn't seem to have any trouble, did they? Must be those strong family genes. She beamed at Marshall. Some men just have that vitality. Mother, Nigel interrupted sharply, pushing his chair back. The table rattled slightly as he stood. I'll clear the plates. In the kitchen, Nigel gripped the sink, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The dishes clinked against one another as his hands trembled. Through the serving window, he saw Marshall leaning close to Samantha, whispering something that made her stifle a laugh. Their parents remained oblivious, deep in a discussion about their vacation home in Florida. Need a hand, brother? Marshall's voice cut through the room, making Nigel's shoulders tense. He turned to see Marshall in the doorway, an empty wine glass in hand. Marshall's grin had a sharpness to it, as though he was enjoying some private joke. I've got it covered, Nigel replied curtly, turning back to the sink. You sure? Multitasking's never been your strength, Marshall teased as he poured himself another glass of wine. Remember when you tried out for the football team? Catching and running at the same time was a bit much for you. Dad was so let down. Before Nigel could fire back, Samantha entered, her voice light. Don't be mean, she said, her tone playful yet layered with intimacy. Nigel has other qualities. The pause before qualities was deliberate and cutting. The evening crawled to its conclusion, greased by wine and forced politeness. Nigel did his best to keep the peace, refilling glasses and steering conversations away from dangerous waters. But the unsettling moments, Samantha and Marshall disappearing briefly, returning with flushed faces and hastily adjusted appearances, were impossible to ignore. As the guests finally began to leave, Margaret cornered Nigel by the Christmas tree, her wine glass swaying precariously. Have you thought about that specialist I mentioned? The one Marshall's friend used? Not tonight, Mom, Nigel said tightly. I'm just saying, she persisted. A man your age should have children by now. Marshall would have had a house full if his marriage hadn't. She trailed off, distracted by Samantha's laughter from the kitchen. She seems happy tonight, Margaret mused, sipping her wine. It's nice to see her smile. She's been so distant lately. Nigel's chest tightened as he turned toward the kitchen. Through the dim light, he saw the shadows of Samantha and Marshall cast against the wall, their laughter a sharp contrast to the storm building inside him. Nigel's gaze followed his mother's, eventually resting on Samantha and Marshall near the refrigerator. They stood in close proximity, their heads tilted toward each other as though exchanging a private joke. As Nigel observed, Marshall's hand drifted to Samantha's lower back, lingering there just long enough to be noticeable. His parents left around 10, excusing themselves with mentions of an early dinner engagement the following day. Margaret gave Nigel a hug before departing, softly admonishing him, "Don't work too hard, darling." The patronizing undertone made his jaw tighten. Once the door closed behind them, Nigel set about methodically tidying up, loading the dishwasher and putting away leftovers. Samantha and Marshall offered to help, but their assistance amounted to little more than stolen glances and stifled laughter, exchanged whenever they thought Nigel wasn't watching. "I'll grab the family photos from the guest room," Marshall announced suddenly. "Mom's been asking for copies of the pictures from last summer's beach trip," he added casually. Samantha's face lit up at the mention, her mood shifting instantly. "I'll help you find them," she offered enthusiastically. "They might be in the album I organized." "Nigel, you don't mind finishing up here, do you? There's not much left," Samantha added with a breezy tone. Before Nigel could answer, the pair were already heading upstairs, their quick steps echoing down the hall. Left alone in the kitchen, Nigel held a half-rinsed wine glass, the muffled sounds of their movements upstairs gnawing at his focus. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder in the quiet room, filling the space with its persistent rhythm. The glass trembled in his hand before he carefully set it down. After drying his hands, Nigel turned toward the stairs, drawn upward by an unshakable urge. Each step felt leaden as he approached the guest room. The door was ajar, and a thin beam of light spilled into the shadowed hallway. Murmurs reached his ears, their words indistinct but the tone unmistakably intimate. Laughter, muffled shuffling, and the faint creak of floorboards broke the silence. Nigel's hand hovered over the doorknob, torn between retreating to preserve the fragile facade or confronting the truth that loomed on the other side. At last, he pushed the door open. The scene inside was burned into his mind. Samantha and Marshall sprang apart, their startled faces illuminated by the warm glow of a bedside lamp. Marshall's lips bore faint traces of smeared lipstick, and Samantha's previously immaculate hair was now tousled. They stood frozen, Marshall's hands still at Samantha's waist, with the family photo album abandoned on the bed like some cruel punchline. "Nigel," Samantha began, but he had already turned on his heel, striding back down the stairs and toward the front door. Her voice followed him, growing more urgent, but he stepped outside into the biting December air. He gripped the porch railing tightly, the cold biting into his skin. Above him, the stars twinkled indifferently, their distant beauty a stark contrast to the chaos within. The snow beneath his shoes crunched as he moved toward the edge of the porch. Festive Christmas lights adorned the neighboring homes, their cheerful glow a mockery of the evening's revelations. Behind him, the door opened and closed, and Samantha's voice pierced the cold night air. "So now you know," she said, her tone sharp and devoid of any remorse. "I guess there's no need for pretense anymore." Nigel turned to face her, the porch light illuminating her face, now contorted into something almost unrecognizable. Her lipstick was smeared, her hair disheveled, but it was her complete lack of shame that stung the most. "How long?" he asked, his voice cold and clipped. "Does it matter?" she shot back, crossing her arms defensively. 5 years if you really want to know, since just after we got married. You were too busy being the perfect husband to notice." Her words landed like blows, but Nigel refused to react. "Why?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Samantha let out a bitter laugh, her breath visible in the freezing air. "Because you couldn't give me what I wanted, a child. And your parents? They adore Marshall. He's everything you're not, passionate, successful, alive. What did you expect?" Inside the house, Nigel caught the faint sound of movement, likely Marshall lingering nearby, savoring the fallout. The thought made Nigel's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Get out," he said, his voice steely and unyielding. Samantha blinked, momentarily stunned. "Excuse me? Get out of my house." Each word was a hammer striking an anvil. "Both of you, now!" Her eyes widened, then narrowed in defiance. "You can't just— I said get out!" he roared, his voice reverberating through the still night. The quiet street seemed to hold its breath. "Pack what you need for tonight and leave." For a moment she appeared ready to argue, but Marshall emerged from the doorway, his rumpled suit and guilty expression betraying his discomfort. "Come on, Samantha," he murmured. "We'll get the rest of your things tomorrow, when he's calmer." The word calmer made Nigel's fists clench, but he remained silent as they gathered their belongings. Upstairs, the sound of drawers opening and closing, punctuated by whispered conversation, felt excruciatingly slow. They were dragging their feet, still confident they held the upper hand. At last, they emerged with a small overnight bag. Marshall kept a possessive arm around Samantha's waist as they walked to his car, their footsteps leaving tracks in the pristine snow. "I'll send someone for the rest of my things," Samantha called over her shoulder, her tone light and dismissive. "Merry Christmas, darling." Nigel stood on the porch, watching their car disappear into the snowy night before retreating inside. The house was eerily quiet, the remnants of Christmas Eve scattered around him, half-clean dishes, empty glasses, and unopened presents beneath the tree. His eyes landed on a family photo perched on the mantel. Taken the previous Christmas, it showed Samantha standing between him and Marshall, her hand resting on Nigel's shoulder, while her body leaned subtly toward his brother. The signs had been there all along. Without hesitation, Nigel seized the photo and hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered with a satisfying crash, but the fleeting release quickly gave way to a cold resolve. Samantha's venomous words echoed in his mind, fueling a burgeoning sense of purpose. They thought they could humiliate him and walk away unscathed. They were wrong. Nigel began cleaning with a precise determination, erasing every physical trace of the night's betrayal. But the memories remained, each one etched vividly in his mind, forming the foundation of a plan. As he worked, his eyes fell on Samantha's phone, forgotten by the sink. He picked it up, gripping it tightly as the first threads of an idea began to take shape. He turned the object over in his hand, his expression unreadable. Naturally, she'd want it back. By tomorrow, she would likely send Marshall to retrieve it, along with the rest of her belongings. Another opportunity for them to flaunt their twisted connection, to revel in their audacity instead of concealing it. With calculated precision, he placed the item in the drawer of his desk. It could serve as evidence or perhaps a bargaining chip. He hadn't decided yet, but its utility was unquestionable. As the grandfather clock announced the arrival of midnight, its chimes echoing the beginning of Christmas Day, Nigel finished tidying up. The kitchen now sparkled with an unnerving perfection, a pristine tableau that erased all traces of the earlier chaos. Standing back, Nigel observed the immaculate scene with a sense of resolution. Anyone stepping into this space would never suspect the turmoil that had erupted mere hours ago. In that instant, his next steps became clear. If they wanted to play their games, he would join them, but on his terms. His approach would be methodical, calculated, and devastatingly effective. There would be no outbursts, no dramatic confrontations. His revenge would be a quiet storm, dismantling their lives piece by piece. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop and began assembling a detailed record. Dates, incidents, and peculiarities he had once overlooked began forming a pattern. Business trips suspiciously aligned with Marshall's travel plans. Oddly timed messages. Abrupt disappearances explained away with hollow excuses. Each entry brought the truth into sharper focus. When his work was done, they would understand the folly of underestimating him. Nigel was no fool. The traits they had dismissed, his loyalty, his precision, his patience, would become his most formidable weapons. In the glow of the Christmas tree lights, their gentle flicker seemed almost conspiratorial, as if urging him onward in his quest for justice. By the end of January, pale winter sunlight streamed through the windows of his home office. 5 weeks had passed since Christmas, and Nigel's collection of evidence had grown into an overwhelming trove. His desk was cluttered with bank records, email exchanges, and call logs, each one a damning piece of the puzzle. A half-empty coffee cup sat forgotten beside his laptop, evidence of the sleepless nights that had consumed him. Each passing hour brought new discoveries, tightening the noose around them. Behind him, the wall had become a web of betrayal, adorned with photographs, documents, and notes linked by red string. A visual map of 5 years of deceit. Muttering to himself, he jotted another detail onto the timeline. Another Chicago trip, he muttered darkly. Same week as Marshall's conference. Samantha's old phone, conveniently left behind that night, had proven invaluable. The text messages were a damning chronicle of infidelity, each message cementing the reality of their betrayal. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. "Sir," came his assistant's voice. "There's a call from Memorial Hospital on line 2, Dr. Garcia's office." Nigel's attention sharpened immediately. "Put them through," he instructed. "Mr. Davidson?" A nervous voice greeted him. "I'm calling regarding your request for Mrs. Davidson's medical records." "Go on," Nigel prompted. "We're unable to release them without her authorization," the caller explained hesitantly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But Dr. Garcia wants to meet with you privately." Nigel's lips curved into a thin smile. "When and where?" "Tonight, 8 p.m., at the coffee shop across from the hospital," she replied. "Excellent. Let him know I'll be there." Before he could continue his work, the security camera feed showed his mother arriving unexpectedly. She clutched her designer handbag as if it were an anchor, her Mercedes still idling in the driveway. When Nigel opened the door, she moved to embrace him, but he stepped back, maintaining a deliberate distance. Her perfume, another ostentatious gift from Marshall, lingered like a bitter reminder. "We've been so worried about you," she said, her tone maternal. "You've been ignoring us." "I've been busy," Nigel said curtly, allowing her into the foyer but no farther. The hallway, stripped of family photos, was as barren as his tone. "What do you need, Mom?" Margaret fiddled nervously with her pearl necklace. "We should talk about Samantha. She's heartbroken, staying in that tiny apartment." "You mean Marshall's penthouse?" Nigel interrupted, his voice sharp. "With the lake view and private elevator? Don't insult me." "Well, Margaret faltered before pressing on. "These things happen in marriages, darling. Your father and I think you should focus on moving forward. Maybe if you'd been more attentive?" Nigel's laugh was cold. "Like Marshall, you mean? Tell me, Mom, did you know about their affair from the start, or did you just look the other way?" "That's unfair," she protested weakly. "Marshall would never—" "Never what?" Nigel snapped. "Sleep with his brother's wife? Lie for years? Explain this, then." He held up his phone, showing her a photo. "Dad's birthday 3 years ago. Look at his hand on her waist. Did you miss it, or did you choose not to see?" Margaret paled as she examined the image. I don't know what to say." "Try the truth," Nigel retorted. "But since honesty isn't your strong suit, you can leave, and tell Marshall his little spy mission failed. If he wants answers, he can face me himself." After she left, Nigel drove to the coffee shop near Memorial Hospital. Dr. Garcia was already waiting, his polished demeanor undermined by the nervous glances he cast around the room. "Mr. Davidson," Garcia greeted him, standing awkwardly as Nigel approached. "Thank you for coming." "An interesting choice of location," Nigel remarked, sitting, "right across from my wife's office in pediatrics." Garcia's hands trembled slightly as he picked up his coffee cup. "How much do you know?" "Everything," Nigel said coolly. "Every meeting, every rendezvous, every so-called consultation. How long before the hospital board finds out?" "Please," Garcia whispered desperately. "My family, my job." "Should have thought of that before you slept with a patient," Nigel replied, sliding a folder across the table. "Especially one carrying a child. Now let's talk about those genetic tests." Garcia's face drained of color. "How did you get this?" "I have my ways," Nigel said evenly. "And I have proof of everything. Here's what happens next." By the time Nigel left, Garcia had handed over everything he needed: confessions, test results, and promises of cooperation. Another piece fell into place: The endgame was near, and Nigel would ensure they felt the full weight of what they had done. The whole plan was almost laughably straightforward. Nigel's phone buzzed yet again, another call from Marshall. No doubt he'd just come across the bouquet Nigel had sent to Garcia's office. The card accompanying the flowers, inscribed with the words "deepest sympathies," must have provoked some uncomfortable inquiries at work. When Nigel arrived home, his father was already waiting for him, his face red with fury. "This has to stop," Robert said, his voice taut with exasperation. "And what about my brother's reputation?" Nigel retorted, his tone frigid and deliberate. "Or mine? Did you conveniently forget how he spread rumors about my mental health to steal my clients? How he branded me as unstable to the board? Was that his way of safeguarding the company or himself?" Robert's jaw tightened. "He was protecting the family." "Just like you always have," Nigel shot back, swiveling his monitor to reveal an email thread. "Like when you helped him cover up the fraud in the Morton account. That could have destroyed my career, cost me my license." The color drained from Robert's face. "Where did you get those emails?" Nigel leaned back in his chair, his smile cold and calculated. "I told you, Dad. I know everything. Every deception, every cover-up, every instance where you chose him over me. Soon, everyone else will know too." The following days blurred into a flurry of meticulous preparation. One by one, Nigel pieced together his case. By Thursday morning, his private investigator handed him a fresh batch of incriminating evidence. "You'll want to see these," Tom said, spreading out photographs. "Your brother's been busy, 3 meetings with the hospital board just this week." Nigel examined the photos. In every shot, Marshall looked increasingly agitated, his polished facade beginning to crumble. "He's putting the screws to Garcia," Tom continued, sliding over a recording device. "I picked this up in the hospital parking garage. Their conversations, enlightening." Nigel pressed play. Garcia's voice came through first, shaking with suppressed anger. "You said you'd handle this. Now my wife's asking questions about the flowers. The board is scrutinizing my cases." "Keep your voice down," Marshall snapped. "Handle it? Like you handled everything else? Those tests were supposed to stay private. If this leaks—" "It won't," Marshall hissed. "Stick to the story. The baby is mine, you understand? I don't care what the DNA says. Fix it. That's your specialty, isn't it?" Nigel's smile was grim as the recording ended. Throughout the day, more evidence flowed in. Hotel receipts proving Garcia's clandestine meetings with Samantha, unexplained bank transfers, and phone records that chronicled their frantic exchanges. Samantha's increasingly desperate texts and voicemails only added to the damning dossier. "Please," her latest message begged. "Think of the baby. Don't do this." Nigel's gaze rested on the DNA test results sitting on his desk. The final, irrefutable proof. This wasn't just about exposing one secret. It would unravel an intricate web of deceit. On his desk lay his mother's invitation to the upcoming family dinner, its thick cream paper and gold embossing a thinly veiled attempt at damage control. They expected him to decline, as he usually did. Instead, he RSVP'd immediately, triggering a flurry of frantic calls between his parents and Marshall. Let them worry. Let them wonder. The truth was inevitable, and Nigel had chosen his moment. By Saturday evening, snow flurries danced in a biting wind as Nigel sat in his car outside the Davidson estate. Through frosted windows, he watched the guests arrive. His briefcase, heavy with damning evidence, rested on the passenger seat. From his vantage point, he could see his mother directing caterers, his father nursing a drink, and Marshall pacing by the fireplace. Samantha and Garcia had not yet arrived, though Nigel had ensured the doctor's presence would be an unpleasant surprise. His phone buzzed. Another message from Samantha. "Please don't go through with this. Let's talk." Nigel ignored it. 5 years of betrayal didn't deserve a reply. When the front door opened, his mother's anxious face greeted him. "Nigel, you actually came. We weren't sure. Miss a family gathering?" Nigel's smile was sharp and devoid of warmth. "When have I ever let you down, Mother?" She winced. "Darling, please. Whatever you're planning—" "Planning?" He brushed past her. "I'm here for dinner. Isn't that what you wanted? The whole family together?" The room fell silent as he entered. His father froze mid-sip, and Marshall's polished smile faltered. "Brother," Marshall began, stepping forward with feigned warmth. "Let's not cause a scene." Nigel's laugh was cutting. "A scene? Like the one you and Samantha made in my guest room last Christmas Eve? Or a different kind altogether?" "Nigel," Robert said, his voice stern. "This isn't the place." "Oh, it's exactly the place." Nigel set his briefcase on the coffee table. "But let's wait. I wouldn't want anyone to miss the show." The doorbell rang, and his mother practically ran to answer it, likely seeking an ally. Instead, she found Dr. Garcia on the doorstep, looking ill at ease in his tailored suit. "I received an invitation," Garcia said hesitantly. "Come in, doctor," Nigel called. "We've been expecting you." Marshall's expression darkened. "What's he doing here?" "Patience, brother. All will be clear soon enough." Nigel glanced at his watch. "We're waiting for one more." As if on cue, Samantha stepped into the doorway, her black dress emphasizing her pregnant belly. Her eyes flicked nervously between Marshall and Garcia. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A family discussion," Nigel replied, gesturing to the chairs. "Take a seat. We have much to cover." "I'm leaving," Marshall growled, moving toward the door. "Sit," Nigel ordered, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "Unless you want me to start with the evidence of your financial fraud and stolen clients." Reluctantly, the room settled into a heavy silence as everyone took their seats. Nigel opened his briefcase and began methodically laying out his evidence. "Let's talk," he said, his tone steady and relentless. "About loyalty, truth, and what it means to be family." He held up the first photograph. Samantha and Marshall, caught together at a family gathering years ago. His voice was measured but unyielding as he began dismantling the web of lies, thread by damning thread. Samantha's voice faltered, barely audible, as she struggled to form coherent words. Her attempt at composure was met with a stifling silence. Across from her, Nigel reached into his briefcase, retrieving another set of photographs, which he scattered across the table with the precision of a prosecutor presenting irrefutable evidence. "Every meeting, every secret rendezvous," he began, his tone icy and detached. "Documented in painstaking detail. You weren't nearly as cautious as you thought." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, a faint gasp escaping as the weight of the accusation settled over her. "We didn't realize," she stammered. "Didn't you?" Nigel's sharp retort sliced through the room as he turned toward his parents. "Let's talk about everything you conveniently didn't notice, like how you've spent your lives idolizing Marshall while dismissing me entirely. Shall we begin there?" Robert, his face pale, protested weakly. "That's not true." Nigel's lips curled into a humorless smile as he retrieved another folder. "No? Then explain this. At my college graduation, you walked out during my valedictorian speech because no one bothered to call you that morning. At my promotion ceremony, you skipped it for Marshall's golf tournament. Every milestone I've achieved, every hard-earned success, you've overshadowed with your golden child's exploits." His gaze shifted to Marshall, whose normally composed demeanor had visibly cracked. "And you," Nigel hissed, "the loyal brother, or so you pretend. Meanwhile, you've been undercutting me at every opportunity, stealing clients, spreading whispers about my mental stability. How many accounts did you poach, Marshall? Shall we go over the exact numbers?" Marshall's face turned ashen as Nigel tossed another file onto the table. "Your managing partner found this particularly enlightening," Nigel added. "It's amazing what people admit when faced with proof of their deceit." "You've always been jealous," Marshall shot back, his voice wavering. "That's what this is about. Samantha chose me because—" "Did she?" Nigel interrupted, a razor-sharp smile playing on his lips. "Dr. Garcia, would you care to elaborate, or should I?" The doctor's face drained of color as Samantha grabbed his arm in desperation. "Louis, don't," she whispered. Marshall's head snapped toward her, his voice rising in disbelief. "Louis? Since when do you call him Louis?" Nigel leaned back in his chair, exuding calm authority. "Why does it matter what she calls her doctor? Unless, of course—" "This is ridiculous," Marshall interjected, fumbling with his tie. "Whatever game you think you're playing—" "Game? Nigel's tone sharpened as he produced another document. Like the game you played, pretending to be the father? DNA results don't lie, brother. The room plunged into an oppressive silence. Margaret's wineglass slipped from her hand, crimson liquid spreading across the carpet like a damning stain. "What are you saying?" Marshall croaked. Nigel turned to Samantha, his expression devoid of sympathy. "Tell them," he demanded. "Tell them about the private consultations, the secret genetic tests. Tell them everything." Samantha's hands instinctively rested on her stomach. "You don't understand," she pleaded. "After I learned about Nigel's vasectomy—" "Vasectomy?" Robert repeated, his confusion plain. "The one I had 5 years ago," Nigel confirmed, his voice steady. "After my cancer scare. I told no one. Yet somehow Samantha discovered she was pregnant shortly after her affair with Marshall began." Samantha turned to Marshall, her voice trembling. "I thought it was yours. I truly did." Tears welled in her eyes. "But it wasn't, was it?" Nigel placed the DNA results on the table. "Shall I read Dr. Garcia's signed confession aloud, or would you prefer to enlighten them yourself?" Dr. Garcia stood abruptly, his forehead glistening with sweat. "I think it's best if I leave." "Sit down," Nigel commanded, his tone like steel. The doctor froze mid-step. "Why don't you explain who the real father is?" Nigel's voice was calm, almost clinical. Marshall stared at Garcia, realization dawning in his eyes. "You and Samantha?" he whispered. Garcia's voice was barely audible. "It wasn't supposed to happen. The appointments? We grew close." Marshall let out a hysterical laugh. "You've slept with my brother's wife, and now mine too?" "She was never yours," Nigel reminded him coldly. "Not then, not now, and the baby isn't yours either." Margaret swayed on her feet, her voice faint. "There must be some mistake." Nigel's gaze was unyielding. "There isn't. The tests are conclusive. Multiple labs verified it. The child is Dr. Garcia's. Samantha has known for months." He turned to her, his eyes hard. "Haven't you?" Samantha's voice broke. "Please, think about the child." "The way you thought about honesty?" Nigel shot back. His gaze flicked to his parents. "This is your golden boy's legacy. Deceit, betrayal, and scandal. Are you still proud?" Robert's face was ashen, his voice barely a whisper. "We never meant—" "Never meant to what?" Nigel cut him off. "Overlook everything I accomplished? Lavish praise on Marshall while ignoring his corruption?" Nigel didn't wait for a reply. He pulled out yet another file. "Speaking of corruption," he continued, "the SEC is very interested in Marshall's financial dealings. Care to explain those?" Marshall lunged for the folder, but Nigel sidestepped him effortlessly. "You have no right," Marshall shouted. "I have every right," Nigel replied coolly. "Just as I have the right to expose every lie, every affair, every theft." Garcia's voice wavered. "What other lies?" Nigel's smile was cold. "Ask Samantha about the golf pro or the insurance adjuster. She's been busy." The room erupted into chaos. Samantha sobbed uncontrollably. Marshall lunged at Garcia, only to be restrained by Robert. Margaret collapsed onto the sofa, mumbling prayers under her breath. "Enough!" Nigel's voice silenced them all. "I have evidence of everything. Copies are ready for the SEC, the hospital board, and the Bar Association. Unless what?" Marshall asked desperately. Nigel's expression was unreadable. "I want you all to live with the truth. Your careers, your reputations, your carefully curated image. It's over." Margaret's plea was barely audible. "You wouldn't do this. We're family." Nigel's laugh was devoid of warmth. "Family? Family doesn't betray one another. You stopped being my family when you chose him over me time and time again." He turned to Samantha. "The divorce papers will arrive Monday. Don't contest them unless you want Garcia's wife to know every sordid detail." To Marshall, he added, "Expect disbarment proceedings next week. Your managing partner already has what he needs." And to his parents, "Use the family trust to cover Marshall's legal fees. He'll need it." Finally, he addressed Garcia. "The hospital board meets Tuesday. I'd suggest exploring a new career path." Robert's voice cracked. "You're destroying us." "No," Nigel replied evenly. You destroyed yourselves. I'm just pulling back the curtain." He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. "Merry Christmas," he said with biting irony. Pausing by the family portrait in the foyer, he removed it from the wall and set it face down on the table. Outside, the snow-covered landscape glimmered in the moonlight. As Nigel started his car, he allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. Through the window, he saw the fractured tableau inside, Marshall pacing, Samantha weeping, his parents clinging to each other. None of it stirred him. The anger that had once consumed him had been replaced by a cold sense of satisfaction. They had underestimated him, dismissed him as the quiet one. Now, they would face the consequences. By morning, the world would know the truth. Careers would collapse, reputations would crumble. But for now, as he drove away, Nigel felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Not forgiveness. They would never deserve that. But the peace of finally standing his ground. Never again would they make the mistake of underestimating him. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.